Just a community college nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling said at 6:41 a.m., standing at the nurse's station with his coffee still steaming, his voice pitched just loud enough for the staff to hear but calibrated to sound casual. He didn't know that the woman whose locker he was looking at had held a dying Marine's intestines together with field gauze and sheer will. He didn't know that her hands, the ones he was silently mocking with a half-smile to the unit director, had performed emergency surgical procedures in places where the nearest operating room was 127 kilometers away. He didn't know that underneath her scrubs, sewn inside the lining of her jacket hanging in that locker, was a faded unit patch so worn the colors had bleached almost invisible. They were wrong about her. Dead wrong. Sacred Heart Emergency Department in San Diego breathes under fluorescent lights like something alive but exhausted. The fluorescent tubes hum a constant frequency that most people stop hearing after 10 minutes. Danielle Ross heard every cycle. She moved through the trauma bay at 5:53 a.m. with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned long ago that being seen was dangerous. Her scrubs were precisely creased. Her stethoscope hung at exactly the same angle as regulation dictated. Her ID badge clipped to the collar of her shirt showed only her first name and credentials, nothing else. Nothing that could lead anyone to ask questions about the gaps in her employment history or why she'd moved to San Diego using her maiden name 14 months ago. The invisibility was intentional. It was survival. It was the only way she could be near her son without telling him why she'd disappeared. The shift started the way all shifts started. Danielle arrived 20 minutes early and organized her supplies with the precision of someone used to working in environments where disorganization meant bodies didn't come home. Trauma shears in the left pocket. Penlight in the right. Gloves triple-stocked. She'd already checked the medication dispensers, verified the crash cart, and reviewed the incoming patient roster before the day staff clocked in. At 5:51 a.m., she was standing at the supply station when Dr. Sterling pushed through the automatic doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking against tile in a rhythm that suggested someone who believed every step should announce his presence. Dr. Sterling was 43 years old, carried himself like someone's idea of what power looked like, and had never once been challenged by anyone who mattered. His mother's maiden name was Hartford. His father sat on the hospital board. His brother-in-law golfed with the chief medical officer every Saturday. These facts moved through Sacred Heart like oxygen, invisible, essential, and completely understood by everyone except the people they harmed. He was the kind of doctor who spoke in volume rather than precision, who used medical terminology the way other men used cologne, to announce their superiority. At 6:03 a.m., Dr. Sterling stopped at Danielle's locker. He wasn't there to speak to her. She wasn't in the locker room. He was there to be visible, to lean against the adjacent locker and speak to two residents who were changing into scrubs. He gestured toward her nameplate with his coffee cup, the gesture small enough to seem thoughtless but calibrated perfectly so that his words would carry. Community college nursing program, he said, not quite looking at the diploma on her locker but close enough that everyone would know what he meant. Some of these diploma mills are getting audited this year. I'm just saying, standards matter. Especially in trauma. You can't just fast-track your way through the hard sciences and expect to handle anything more complex than wound dressing. One of the residents laughed. The other one didn't. Neither of them said anything back. Danielle was in the trauma bay, 400 feet away, prepping a stretcher for an incoming patient. She didn't hear the comment. She would have ignored it anyway. Invisibility meant not reacting. Invisibility meant survival. But she would hear about it by noon, filtered through the careful silence of nurses who knew which way the wind blew in this hospital. At 6:15 a.m., the radio crackled, Sacred Heart ED, this is Flight Ops. We have an inbound military medical transport. ETA 18 minutes. Penetrating chest trauma, Marine Commander Webb, single GSW to the left anterior thorax with possible cardiac involvement. Commander's wife and adult son are accompanying. This patient is Priority 1. Repeat, Priority 1. The ED shifted without anyone moving. That's what happens when a military transport announces itself with those words. Priority 1. Possible cardiac involvement. Marine commander. The words hang in the air like a change in barometric pressure. Everyone feels it, even the ones who don't want to admit they're paying attention. Danielle felt the shift. Everyone did. But what happened in her body was different. Her hands, which had been steady, stilled completely. The tremor that lived in her right hand now, the one that came with the PTSD, the one that had ended her Navy career and forced her into this parallel life, showed up in a single involuntary flex of her fingers. She controlled it immediately. She always did. But for 1 second, 1/4 of a breath, the past reached up through the present and grabbed her by the throat. She was still moving, still preparing the bay, still doing everything she was supposed to do. But something in her had recognized those words. Marine commander. Tikrit. The city that lived in her nightmares in high definition. At 6:22 a.m., Dr. Sterling was in the physician's lounge reading his phone when he heard the radio announcement. He looked up, caught the name of the unit from which the patient was being transported, and allowed himself a small smile. A high-profile patient. Military command. The kind of case that got written up in hospital newsletters and board meetings. He set his phone down and began walking toward the ED with the unhurried confidence of someone who assumed his presence would be necessary. Danielle moved through the trauma bay with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this work in rooms with no electricity, no backup, and no margin for error. At 6:28 a.m., she was running blood work on a motorcycle collision victim, a 19-year-old with a compound fracture and possible internal bleeding. Her movements were economical. No wasted motion. No pause. She placed a 18-gauge for Drew Labs, initiated a second line, and was already calling up the imaging results when a second trauma came through the doors at 6:31 a.m. This one was a 42-year-old man with acute cardiac symptoms and no clear cause. The ED's heart monitor was already showing ST elevation. He needed immediate assessment and possible transfer to the coronary care unit. Danielle was the only nurse with a free hand, and the younger residents were still managing the motorcycle patient. She moved to the new admission without being asked, without waiting for an assignment from charge nursing. The work just pulled her in the way work does when you know what you're doing. She got a second line. She ran EKGs. She placed the cardiac monitor leads with the precision of someone whose hands remembered the exact anatomy of the human chest. The patient was scared, they always are, but her voice, when she spoke, had that quality that certain nurses have, the one that makes people believe they're going to be okay even when everyone in the room knows the odds. You're in the right place now. We're going to get answers. I'm right here with you. The tremor in her hand didn't show. It never did. At 6:39 a.m., Captain Marcus Webb arrived through the ambulance bay doors on a stretcher, his wife holding his hand on one side and his adult son, a Marine himself, built like someone who'd inherited his father's command presence, holding the other. The commander was conscious but pale, his breathing rapid, his shirt cut away to reveal the entrance wound just below his left collarbone. Blood. Not a lot yet. Not the kind of bleeding you see. The kind of bleeding happening inside, where nobody can see it until it kills you. Danielle watched from across the ED. She registered his face, his rank insignia on the chart, the name that the paramedic was calling out. Commander Marcus Webb. She did not miss a beat with the cardiac patient she was monitoring. She did not flinch. She did not let the name do anything to her except move through her consciousness and away. Invisibility meant compartmentalization. It meant showing no reaction that could later be called into question. Dr. Sterling moved toward the incoming patient with the confident stride of a man who believed every room improved when he entered it. He was already dictating orders, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. Get him to trauma 2. Start a second line. I want a stat chest X-ray and fast ultrasound. Someone contact cardiothoracic. He stopped. He looked at the patient. He looked at the chart. He then turned toward the nursing staff with his eyes landing on Danielle, who had just finished placing a saline lock on her cardiac patient and was preparing to assist with the new admission. "Not you," Dr. Sterling said. Not a question. Not a request. A statement that fell into the room like a closing door. "I need my senior residents on this case. This patient requires," he paused, clearly choosing his words with precision, "experienced hands. No offense, Ms. Ross, but I need people with actual institutional training on a case like this." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheezed on the motorcycle patient's respirator. Danielle looked up from her supplies. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She did not blink. She did not blush. She did not say anything, because saying nothing was the form her composure took. She simply turned back to her medications, noted his directive in the task management system, and continued her work with the cardiac patient as if she had never expected anything different. But her hands had stilled for one moment. Just one. In that moment, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with the Marine Expeditionary Unit emblem that had been worn smooth by a decade of silent memory, shifted slightly as her breath changed. Just a patch. Just fabric. But it was there. It had always been there. Waiting. The motorcycle patient needed her attention. The cardiac patient's heart rate was climbing. And Commander Marcus Webb was being wheeled into Trauma 2 with Dr. Sterling already calling for equipment that wouldn't arrive in time if something went wrong. Danielle Ross checked her watch, 6:41 a.m. She had no way of knowing that by 9:53 a.m., everything in this hospital would change. She had no way of knowing that she was about to spend the next 6 hours fighting not just for a patient's life, but for the truth of who she actually was. She had no way of knowing that invisibility was about to become impossible. But somewhere deep in her body, in the part that used to be trained in things hospitals couldn't teach, something was already waking up. She needed more gauze. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the trauma bay like a blade before she even saw his face. "Step back, Ross. This case requires actual credentials." Danielle didn't move. Her hands remained steady on the 4 poles she'd been positioning, her eyes fixed on the monitor mount above the gurney. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Around her, the trauma team froze mid-motion, aware that something had shifted in the room's pressure. "Our community college nurse thinks she's qualified for military trauma," Sterling continued, turning to address the gathered staff with the practiced condescension of a man who had learned that cruelty could sound like education. "Adorable, really." 3 residents exchanged glances. The respiratory therapist suddenly found the oxygen tubing very interesting. Then the doors burst open and they wheeled him in. Captain Marcus Webb. Commander Marcus Webb, to be precise, though the rank didn't matter when you were unconscious and bleeding. His wife Claire walked beside the stretcher, her hand gripping the rail with the white-knuckled intensity of someone watching their entire world become breakable. Their adult son, Lieutenant Daniel Webb, still in dress blues from wherever he'd been when the call came, moved with the controlled panic that military families knew how to perform. 1 step behind. Eyes forward. Don't fall apart until you know if he's going to. Danielle's breath caught. Not visibly. Not in any way that Sterling would notice or anyone else would register. But somewhere deep in her chest, where memories lived that she'd spent 6 years trying to bury, something tilted. Sterling turned to Claire Webb with the kind of smile that dissolved instantly into patronization. "Mrs. Webb, your husband will receive care from our most experienced team." He gestured toward the senior attending. "Ross here is more suited to bedpans than battlefield injuries." Despite her enthusiasm, Claire's face tightened. The skin around her mouth went pale. Danielle watched the wife of a man she'd once followed into rooms she couldn't speak about process the information that this hospital was going to treat her husband's life-or-death emergency with a cardiologist who had just publicly insulted the one person who could recognize the subtle signs of cardiac tamponade developing in real time. Danielle took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in a bunker in Tikrit while mortar rounds walked closer. She felt the tear escape before she could stop it, not from sadness, but from something older and sharper. Rage, maybe. or the particular helplessness of watching someone try to destroy you while a man who'd kept her son alive lay bleeding on a stretcher 10 feet away. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Then, voice level as a surgical laser, "I've already stabilized 2 traumas this shift while you were in administration." She said it not to him. She said it to Claire Webb. To Daniel Webb, who was staring at her now with something flickering behind his eyes. To the truth of what she'd done and what Sterling had tried to erase. Sterling's jaw clenched. For a moment, less than a moment, a fraction too small to measure, he looked like a man who'd just realized someone wasn't going to break the way he'd planned. Then he gestured toward the doors with calculated dismissal. "Get her out of here. I want Ross nowhere near this case. She can restock supplies and contemplate her limitations." Danielle turned and walked toward the supply room without a word, feeling the weight of her father's old unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket underneath her scrubs. The patch that no one knew was there. The patch that had been sewn by her own hand 7 years ago, on the night she decided she couldn't be senior chief petty officer anymore, that she could only be Danielle Ross, community college nurse, and even that, it seemed, was too much to ask. The break room at 1:27 p.m. was exactly as sterile as her apartment. Fluorescent lights. A refrigerator humming like a dying animal. A microwave that smelled like old coffee and regret. Danielle sat with her lunch, a container of chicken she wouldn't taste, a granola bar she wouldn't eat, a water bottle sweating condensation onto the table like everything in this place eventually sweated. Like everything eventually came undone. The 4 nurses who worked the adjacent pod saw her and froze in the doorway. Melissa. Robert. Chen. Thompson. People she'd eaten lunch with for 3 years. People who'd asked her for advice on 4 placements. People who'd learned, very efficiently, that Sterling's campaign had a cost. The cost was you. They exchanged glances. Not unkind glances. Terrified glances. Melissa gathered her yogurt and granola. Robert unplugged his phone from the wall. Chen and Thompson moved as a unit, collecting their belongings like they were evacuating a building. No one spoke. No one made eye contact with Danielle. They simply departed, their presence evaporating as if she'd been a hallucination. The unit secretary, Patricia, leaned into the doorway. "Sterling's got her marked," she whispered to a third-year resident who'd followed her in. "Nobody wants to be associated." Last person who defended Ross got pulled from the trauma rotation. The resident nodded with the gravity of someone learning which doors in a hospital led to safety and which led to professional erasure. Patricia left. The door swung shut. Danielle sat alone in a room designed to hold 7 people, and the silence was the kind that comes from being systematically removed from the existence of everyone around you. At 2:15 p.m., Sterling posted the write-up. The main hallway where every staff member passed at least twice during a shift. Eye level. The paper was official, hospital letterhead, date-stamped, formatted with the precision of documentation designed to be permanent. Nurse D. Ross, formal reprimand. Failure to follow chain of command. Questioning physician orders. Demonstrating inadequate knowledge of scope limitations. Recommend further competency evaluation and potential disciplinary hearing. His signature was meticulous. A man who'd learned that cruelty could be formalized and filed and made official, which made it legitimate, which made it true, which made the community college nurse who'd saved 2 lives today into a fraud who needed to be erased. Danielle read it standing alone while staff walked past without acknowledgement. A trauma surgeon. 2 nurses. The ER director who'd observed her work for 3 years and never once questioned her competence. They all saw the write-up. They all walked past it. They all walked past her. Sterling appeared beside her, his presence like cold air pressure dropping before a storm. Community college doesn't teach you to know your place, does it, diploma mill? His voice was casual. Conversational. The voice of a man who was already mentally rewriting the narrative of this hospital in his favor, where Danielle Ross had always been the problem, where removing her would be an act of institutional necessity. She stared at the commander's room. Through the observation window, she could see the monitors. The cardiac rhythm. The pressures. The subtle signs that the body was beginning to compensate for something Sterling couldn't see yet. "That man needs chest decompression monitoring every 30 minutes, she said quietly. "Or his pericardium will fill." Sterling smiled coldly. The smile of a man who'd just been reminded that she was still functioning, still thinking, still dangerous in ways he hadn't yet quantified. "I'll decide what he needs. You'll stay away from my patient." He walked away before she could respond. Before she could tell him that staying away was something she was very good at. That invisibility was something she'd perfected. That 6 years of being a ghost in her own life had taught her exactly how to watch people die without anyone knowing she was there. But that wasn't the worst part. Hour 1 passed with Danielle monitoring the commander's status from the hallway outside his room. Sterling had restricted her access. She couldn't enter, couldn't chart, couldn't touch. But she could watch the monitor from the open doorway. She could see the venous pressure creeping upward. She could see the cardiac rhythm beginning to compress, subtle as hypothermia, the body slowly suffocating from the inside while the conscious world moved in an entirely different timeline. She could see Claire Webb holding her husband's unconscious hand and praying to a god who gave her a Marine who followed orders and apparently a hospital that wanted him dead. At 1:53 p.m., she approached Sterling in the medication room. Her voice was low. Respectful of his territory, his authority, his need to be right. His JVD is rising, heart sounds are decreasing bilaterally, he needs an echo. Sterling didn't look up from the 4 medication he was preparing. He waved his hand like he was dismissing a sound that had briefly interrupted his work. "I'll order what he needs, Ross. Let me worry about medical decisions." She left without pushing. This was what she'd learned in 6 years, that sometimes survival meant not fighting. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was close your mouth and let the people with credentials and power believe they were in control. Hour 2 brought Danielle Webb into the break room where Danielle was refilling the coffee station, a task that seemed to be the only thing Sterling would allow her near. He held an envelope of letters, the kind that came from deployments, where a man in command writes home to his son about the people who matter. About the people he trusts. She brought him coffee without being asked. The kind of care that community college nurses, apparently, were suited to provide. Daniel looked up at her and something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of a question he wasn't sure how to ask. "My dad writes about everyone in his unit," he said, his voice carrying the precision of someone trained to communicate across distances and time. "He says the good leaders remember the people who saved them." Danielle's hand trembled on the coffee cup. For exactly 1/10 of a second, the military part of her, the part that could read a room in darkness and anticipate threats before they materialized, experienced absolute, clinical panic. She set the cup down carefully. "Your father sounds like a good man." Daniel nodded, and his eyes held hers a moment too long. "He is. He mentioned someone a lot. The senior chief who held the line at Tikrit. Dad says that person's the reason half his unit came home." He paused. Waited. Watched her face with the intensity of someone who recognized something in her that she'd spent 6 years learning to hide. "I wonder what happened to them. Whether they're okay now." Danielle excused herself and walked toward the supply room, her chest moving carefully, her breath measured and medical. Because outside the trauma bay, Sterling made his first call. "Richard, it's James Sterling." His voice dropped to the tone he used for conversations that were meant to be confidential, which meant he was standing in a hallway where everyone could hear him, which meant he wanted everyone to hear him. "We have a situation with a nurse." "Yes, the board meeting next week. I need you ready to vote on termination. Her credentials are questionable. Her attitude is insubordinate. I'm protecting Sacred Heart's reputation." He paused, listening to whatever reassurance his golf club friend offered him. "Thank you, Richard. I'll send you documentation." He made a second call 40 minutes later, this time to HR, his voice carrying the bureaucratic precision of a man who'd learned that institutional language could transform personal vendetta into policy. HR? James Sterling. I'm filing a formal complaint about Nurse Ross practicing beyond scope. Challenging my medication orders, offering unsolicited clinical opinions, attempting to take authority she doesn't possess. I need it documented today. Yes, I'll have the write-up to you by end of shift. He made a third call from his office, door closed, thinking no one could hear him. But hospital walls were thin as paper and secrets traveled through them like oxygen. I need background on Danielle Ross. Anything that doesn't match her application. Birth name, employment history, social media, residence changes, anything unusual. Yes, the usual rate. He paused. Listened. I think she's hiding something. I'm not sure what yet, but I will be. Send me everything. Hour 3 approached. The commander's vitals began to shift. Danielle stood in the supply room watching the clock on her phone, 2:34 p.m., feeling the weight of 6 years and the weight of a unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket and the weight of a man named Marcus Webb whose son had just looked at her like he was seeing a ghost come back to explain why it had disappeared. She felt one more tear escape. Wiped it. Took a breath. Then she walked out of the supply room, walked to the trauma bay, and found Sterling writing notes at the counter. She waited for him to look up. Waited for the moment of complete attention. When his eyes met hers, she took one measured breath and said with absolute calm precision, 6 hours ago you would have let him die waiting for a surgeon who's still in traffic. I'll be in the supply room if his pericardium fills again. She turned and walked away before he could respond, before his face could arrange itself into anger or threats, before anything could move faster than the quiet authority of someone who'd already survived worse than this hospital could offer. The supply room smelled like bleach and plastic packaging. Danielle sat in the chair beside the restocking cart and waited for the sound of a monitor alarm she knew was coming. She'd heard it in her bones since the moment Sterling had dismissed her from the trauma bay. She knew the timeline of cardiac tamponade. She knew how long the body could compensate. She knew exactly what hour it would fail. She knew everything Sterling had forgotten. Everything he'd tried to erase. The monitor showed what Sterling couldn't see. Danielle stood in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 4, her eyes tracking the cardiac rhythm on the overhead screen, watching the waveform shift with the subtle persistence of a tide coming in. Normal sinus rhythm at 102 beats per minute. Then 98. Then the pressure tracing began its slow climb, central venous pressure rising like water filling a cup. Her body knew what her mouth couldn't say. She'd seen this pattern before. She'd seen it in the desert outside Fallujah when a Marine took shrapnel to the chest and his lung filled with blood while the forward operating medic watched the wrong monitor. She'd seen it in the pre-dawn hours of a mission she'd never speak about, when knowing the difference between compartment syndrome and tamponade meant the difference between walking home and being carried. The fluorescent ceiling lights cast their flat white glow across the hallway tile, and Danielle moved herself further down the corridor, keeping the monitor visible through the observation window but maintaining the distance Sterling had enforced with the precision of a perimeter. The ward had its rhythms, its hierarchies. Dr. Sterling's dismissal of her had moved through Sacred Heart like a pressure wave through water, invisible but total. Nurses who'd worked beside her 3 hours ago now moved around her like water around a stone, offering no eye contact, no nods, no recognition of the 3 critical stabilizations she'd performed on her shift. The attending from cardiothoracic had almost stopped to speak to her in the break room around hour 1. He'd opened his mouth. He'd seen Sterling's glare from the other side of the unit and had simply collected his coffee and left without speaking. Hour 1 became hour 2 with a grinding slowness that only emergency medicine could produce. Everything moved fast until it didn't, and then time became something else entirely, a weapon, a pressure gauge, a countdown nobody acknowledged until bodies failed. The commander's wife, Claire Webb, had been escorted to the family waiting room with gentle firmness, but not before Danielle caught the question forming behind her eyes. Her son Daniel had gone with her, his uniform crisp and uncertain, like he couldn't decide if his rank meant anything inside a civilian hospital. It didn't. Nobody's rank meant anything here except Sterling's, and he wore it like a crown he'd purchased rather than earned. The monitor showed the CVP climbing again. 85 millimeters of mercury. 90. The cardiac rhythm had shifted into something that looked almost normal from a distance but told a different story if you knew how to read the space between the lines. Danielle did. She'd interpreted monitor strips in convoy vehicles and makeshift aid stations, had watched the EKG become a language more honest than words. The baseline voltage was dropping, electrical alternans, the waveform shrinking like air pressure descending in a closing door. The pericardium was filling. Fluid was accumulating around the commander's heart with the patience of a certainty, and Sterling was somewhere inside that room looking at everything except the one thing that mattered. She didn't flinch when the patient care tech, Marcus, walked past without speaking. She didn't react when the newer nurses navigated around her like she carried contagion. Composure was what she had left. Composure and the absolute certainty that she was watching a man die from a diagnosis that would take Sterling another 70 minutes to confirm, if the surgeon didn't arrive first, if the fluid didn't accumulate too fast, if the tamponade didn't complete and the heart stopped filling entirely. The math was running in her head like a parallel processor. The surgeon was still on the 5, traffic crawling near the Balboa Park exit, 43 minutes minimum. The commander's pressure was climbing at a rate of 5 millimeters every 4 minutes. The fluid was doing its work with the slow violence of inevitability. Hour 2 shifted into hour 3 like a gear engaging. The monitor showed the story that Sterling wasn't reading. The JVD would be visible now if anyone looked, the neck veins distended like cords, the skin showing the pressure building underneath. The respiratory rate was climbing. 86, 88, 90. The body compensating for a heart that couldn't fill, that couldn't pump, that was being crushed by its own defense mechanism. The pericardium that usually protected was becoming a prison. Danielle had felt this before. Not in her own body, but in her hands during procedures, in her muscle memory during resuscitations, in the absolute knowledge that comes from holding human lives while they made their decisions about whether to stay or go. The hallway felt longer than it had 3 hours ago. The emergency department had that particular smell it took on in a late morning, antiseptic mixed with dried blood and the metallic undertone of anxiety. Someone's coffee sat abandoned on the desk. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The code blue alert system was quiet, but Danielle knew how quickly quiet could become chaos. She knew the precise moment when a patient's decomposition accelerated, when the slow decline became a vertical drop, when the next sound wouldn't be the monitor but the alarm that nobody wanted to hear. The commander's O2 saturation sat at 94. High enough that Sterling wouldn't be alarmed. Low enough that Danielle heard the message underneath. The lungs were struggling against fluid, against pressure, against the physics of a heart too compressed to do its work. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds and let her training speak. Pericardiocentesis at the 5th intercostal space below the left nipple. 18-gauge needle angled at 45 degrees. The hiss of air as the catheter broke through the pericardium. The sudden decompression when the fluid released. The commander's blood pressure climbing back from the edge. The heart filling again, the body's chemistry rebalancing, the narrow window between death and recovery opening just wide enough. But that window required someone with steady hands and the absolute willingness to act without permission. It required someone who understood that protocol existed for the people who didn't yet know how to break it correctly. The monitor showed another shift. The interval between the P wave and the QRS complex was lengthening, the early signs of electrical instability, the heart's rhythm beginning to fragment under pressure. 93 beats per minute. 89. Then spiking back to 101. The pattern of a system failing, not yet failing completely, but failing in the way that failure always came, with warnings that everyone could see if they looked in the right places. Danielle turned and walked toward the supply room. Not to hide. Not to retreat. But because in exactly 40 minutes, that monitor would show what Sterling had dismissed, and she would need to be close enough to act, which meant she needed to be far enough away that his pride wasn't shattered by her proximity. It was calculus. It was strategy. It was the understanding that had been beaten into her across more than 2 decades of service. Sometimes the only way to save someone was to let them believe they were saving themselves. The supply room was cold and narrow, lined with boxes of sterile gloves and saline bags and the 1,000 small consumables that held emergency medicine together. Danielle stood in the darkness, her hand resting on a shelf, and waited. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt heavier than it had that morning. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where it was and what it meant and which Marine it belonged to, because she'd held that young officer when he was learning to be a leader, and she'd told him once that the responsibility of command was never the decisions you made, it was the ones you lived with after. The commander was learning that now, whether he knew it or not. Hour 3 passed like a held breath. Nothing happened and everything prepared to happen. The hospital moved around her with its ordinary crises and small victories, and somewhere in Trauma Bay 4, Sterling was telling himself a story about competence and control that was about to meet the one thing money and board connections couldn't prepare him for, the reality of a patient whose body had already made its decision about what came next. Hour 3 arrived with a sound like breaking glass, not literal, but the kind of silence that shatters before alarms do. The commander's monitor betrayed him first. The CVP line climbed. 70. 75. 80. Numbers that meant pressure building inside the pericardial sac, fluid accumulating around a heart that had nowhere left to expand. Danielle heard it from the supply room where she'd been waiting with the patience of someone who understood that certainty and timing were the only weapons left. The intercom crackled, code blue, Trauma Bay 4. She didn't move. Not yet. She'd calculated this moment for 47 minutes, the exact window between Sterling's clinical indifference and catastrophic failure. Sterling arrived at a run, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor like something small and desperate. His hands were already shaking. The attending cardiologist was still 12 minutes away, stuck in traffic on I-5 near the Balboa Avenue exit. The resident stood frozen. 2 nurses hovered without direction. The monitor painted the story in red, pressure dropping, oxygen saturation plummeting, heart rate climbing in the way that meant the organ was trying to beat against an ocean of fluid. 88 beats per minute. 92. 104. A drumbeat that couldn't sustain itself much longer. Sterling grabbed the ultrasound probe with both hands. Both hands trembling. He positioned it over the commander's chest, searching for the subcostal window, the angle that would show him the pericardial effusion he should have seen 3 hours ago. His fingers moved without precision, hesitant, second-guessing themselves. The screen showed him the heart, but not clearly. He adjusted. Adjusted again. The probe shook. 15 seconds passed. 20. The commander's systolic pressure dropped to 60. 58. The monitor's alarm tone became a shriek. "Someone get me a better view," Sterling said. His voice cracked. "Someone help me see." "Step back." Danielle was already moving. She hadn't walked past the security guard so much as he'd turned to answer a call and she was gone, muscle memory from a decade of operating in spaces where hesitation meant death. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, faded from sand and blood and time, moved with her like a talisman. Sterling's eyes widened. "Get her out. Now." "Security." Danielle took the ultrasound probe from his trembling hands with a movement so smooth it looked gentle. It wasn't gentle. It was a displacement of authority, the kind that happens when someone who has already survived the worst takes control of a moment that hasn't yet learned how fatal it can be. She placed the probe in the subcostal space. Perfect angle. The window opened like a door. There. The effusion. Dark. Massive. The heart drowning in its own fluid, compressed from all sides, unable to fill or eject. Tamponade. Complete and escalating. Pericardiocentesis kit, she said. Not a request. The tone belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed under circumstances where failure meant flags and notifications and mothers receiving phone calls at 3 in the morning. "I said get her," Sterling's voice rose. A resident moved. Another nurse scrambled. The kit materialized. 18-gauge needle. Local anesthetic. Sterile field. Danielle's hands moved with the kind of precision that comes from having done the same procedure 43 times under conditions considerably worse than a well-lit trauma bay. She palpated the xiphoid process. Marked the entry point. Drew the skin taut. Anesthetized the approach. The needle advanced at exactly 45 degrees, aimed toward the left shoulder, gliding through the fascia with the subtle resistance of tissue, knowing it was in the hands of someone who understood its architecture. She drew back. Dark blood filled the syringe. 20 milliliters. 30. 40. The monitor's alarm tone began to lower, a descending shriek becoming something closer to normal rhythm. The commander's pressure climbed. 58 became 70. 72 became 84. Oxygen saturation rose from 88 to 92. The heart found room to beat again. The room went dead silent. A voice arrived in that silence, not from the trauma bay, but from the doorway. Dr. Patricia Chen from cardiology, still in her coat, stethoscope around her neck, having heard the code called and run from the parking garage. She stepped forward and watched the last 15 seconds of the procedure, the catheter placement, the fluid withdrawal, the commander's chest rising and falling with something approaching normal mechanics. "That's textbook," Chen said quietly. "Who performed that?" Sterling's face drained of color. His jaw worked without words. His hands, which had been shaking moments before, became absolutely still in the way that happens when all the blood has left them. Danielle set down the syringe and stepped back from the stretcher without expression. She'd already removed the gloves. Her hands looked like they belonged to someone who had never trembled in her life, which was technically true. The trembling came later, in private, pressed against cold stone in the rain. "Security," Sterling said. His voice had changed. It was flat now. Controlled. The voice of someone who understood that rage would lose him everything, so he was choosing ice instead. "Get her out. Now." She violated every protocol. Every single protocol. 2 security guards arrived. Danielle didn't resist. Resistance would have made the case against her stronger, and she was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already calculating Sterling's next moves, already understanding that this moment, witnessed by the attending cardiologist and the resident and the nurses and Claire Webb and Daniel Webb standing in the observation window with his father's hand still gripped in his, would become either her exoneration or her extinction depending on who controlled the narrative. Sterling controlled the narrative. He had board connections. He had an investigator on speed dial. He had a strategy, and Danielle understood, watching him recover his composure as the security guards escorted her toward the exit, that he was already reformulating, already moving from the tactical loss of this single patient to the strategic destruction of someone who had made him look helpless in front of his peers. The rain had started between hour 3 and hour 5. It hammered the parking lot at Sacred Heart Memorial with the kind of intensity that made the asphalt shine and steam rise in visible waves. Danielle stood at her husband's grave because there was nowhere else to stand when everything else had been taken. El Camino Memorial Park at dusk, with the rain and the wind and the grave stretching out like a city of the dead. Sergeant Thomas Ross. Died in service. The dates carved into stone that would outlast everyone who'd ever loved him. She pressed her forehead against the cold wet granite. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. But something inside her that had been holding together through sheer tactical discipline fractured like the kind of damage that shows up later on scans as a hairline that becomes a rupture. "I saved the man keeping our son alive," she whispered to the stone. "And I still failed you. I'm still running." Her phone buzzed at that moment, the kind of timing that God or chance or both seemed to favor when the universe wanted to remind someone how thoroughly it controlled the trajectory of their falling. Board hearing. 8 a.m. tomorrow. Emergency session. Termination of employment pending investigation. She read the message without emotion, understanding that Sterling had made his 3 calls from his office, one to the board chairman who owed him leverage, one to HR with documentation he'd been preparing since the moment she'd removed him from the commander's case, and one to an investigator who specialized in finding exactly the kinds of holes that didn't exist in Danielle Ross's 3-year employment history because there was simply nothing before that, nothing at all, just a name change and a new social security routing and a woman who had learned to become invisible because invisibility had kept her son alive. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 7:53 a.m. in the hospital's administrative conference room when a sedated patient in Curtin Bay for a refugee named Rashid Mansouri, admitted overnight for appendicitis, still technically under anesthesia, began shouting in Arabic, thrashing against the soft restraints that weren't meant to hold anything but comfort. His voice rose. The ER staff moved toward him. And then, suddenly, he was pointing toward the corridor where Danielle Ross stood in her fresh scrubs, waiting to be told her life was over. "You," Rashid screamed. "You. Tikrit Garrison, 2012. You are the senior chief who held the perimeter." The ER froze. The room exhaled. The machines beat their mechanical rhythm, indifferent to what had just been spoken in Arabic, then in English, then in the shattered silence of recognition. Rashid's sedated body thrashed against the restraints, his voice hoarse, "Senior Chief. You held the perimeter. You held us." The words hung in the fluorescent bright air like bullets that had already landed. Danielle didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge the patient who had just named her in front of the entire emergency department. Her hands remained steady at the monitor, her face a mask of clinical focus, but every person in that ER understood in that moment that they were standing next to someone who had survived things that would have broken ordinary people into pieces. Dr. Sterling stood frozen 30 feet away, his mouth open, his phone still in his trembling hand from his 5th call of the hour. He had been building his case methodically. Systematically. The way a man builds something he believes is bulletproof. First, the call to Chairman Whitmore at 5:24 p.m., the golf buddy, the board connection, the man who owed Sterling a favor from the Laguna Niguel real estate deal 2 years back. Sterling's voice had been measured, concerned. "Gerald, I need to flag something. That nurse, Ross, she performed a procedure on my patient without attending physician authorization. Pericardiocentesis. Community college training, Gerald. She's practicing beyond her scope and I'm documenting it formally." Whitmore had listened. Had believed. Had promised to look into it immediately. Then the call to HR Director Patricia Sohn at 6:03 p.m. Sterling had his fabricated timeline ready, dates, times, alleged incidents. "Patricia, I'm filing a formal complaint. Ms. Ross failed to follow chain of command, performed unauthorized interventions, and I believe she falsified her nursing credentials during her application process. I have documentation." He didn't have documentation. But Patricia would create the paperwork. That was how it worked. The paperwork came after the accusation. The accusation was currency. And Sterling had spent years learning how to spend it. By 6:19 p.m., he had activated his investigator, a man named Caldwell who specialized in background checks, digging through personnel files, finding the leverage points that could destroy a career. Sterling had hired him twice before. Both times, the target had been forced to resign within a week. Caldwell's voice on the phone had been smooth, professional. "What am I looking for, doctor?" Sterling had answered, "Everything. Military service history, work records, financial irregularities, character issues. I want it by morning." The network was spinning now. The machine was engaged. Sterling could feel the machinery moving beneath him, the gears turning in his favor. This was what institutional power felt like. This was how you made someone invisible again. You didn't attack them directly. You let the system do it for you. The complaint filed with the state board. The credentialing review triggered. The investigation launched. By the time Danielle Ross realized what was happening, she would already be gone. What Sterling didn't see was the young man sitting in the server room on the 2nd floor. Marcus Chen, 28 years old, IT security specialist for Sacred Heart Hospital, and decorated Marine Corps veteran, 3 tours, 2 as a communications NCO with 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Chen had watched Sterling attempt to delete the security footage from the trauma bay at 6:31 p.m. Click! 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 Files disappearing from the server logs. But Chen's backup system, the one he'd installed 3 months ago specifically because he didn't trust the hospital's primary architecture, recorded every deletion attempt, timestamp and file name preserved like evidence at a crime scene. Chen had watched the deletion log scroll across his secondary monitor. He had watched it happen in real time. And he had picked up his phone at 6:35 p.m. and called security with 4 words, "You need to see this now." The security footage from hour 3 was pristine. Every frame preserved. Sterling's hands trembling over the ultrasound probe as the pericardial effusion filled the space around Commander Webb's heart. Sterling's frozen paralysis. The moment when he should have acted and didn't. And then Danielle stepping into the frame with a 20-gauge needle in her hand, her movement so precise that the cardiology attending had later called it the cleanest pericardiocentesis I've seen in 15 years of practice. She drained 380 milliliters of blood from the pericardial sac in 4 minutes. For minutes. The commander's oxygen saturation had climbed from 71 to 94. His blood pressure had gone from 68 systolic to 107. She had brought a man back from the edge of death while Sterling stood with his hands shaking and his authority evaporating like sweat on cold tile. That night, after security had escorted her from the building with her personal effects in a cardboard box, her stethoscope, her trauma shears, the photograph of her son in dress blues that she kept in her locker, Danielle had driven to Greenwood Memorial Cemetery in her 2008 Honda Civic. Rain hammered the windshield. The wipers squeaked their metronome rhythm. She had parked at the far edge of the cemetery, away from the maintained areas, away from where family visited on Sunday afternoons. The grave was simple. No monument. No elaborate stone. Just a bronze plaque flush with the earth, Lieutenant Colonel David Ross. 1975 to 2014. Beloved husband and father. She had stood there in the rain, mud soaking through her sneakers, and pressed her forehead against the cold bronze until her vision blurred. The rain ran down her face like she was crying. She wasn't crying. She never cried. But she stood there anyway, speaking to the man who had held her when she came home from Tikrit with nightmares that lasted until dawn, who had asked her who she was becoming when she pulled the covers over her head and refused to be touched, who had found her standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m. holding a knife and asking herself if the pain would ever stop. David Ross, who had loved her when she couldn't love herself. Who had died 2 years later, a heart attack, suddenly, without warning, the irony so cruel that she had laughed when they told her. A cardiac event. The thing she understood. The thing she could have fixed if he'd been in an operating room instead of behind the steering wheel of his car on the 5 freeway. "I saved the man keeping our son alive," she whispered to the plaque, the rain cold on her lips. "I saved Commander Webb and I still failed you. I'm still running. I'm still invisible. And now I'm invisible from Daniel too, just like I wanted, just like I planned, and I hate it." The words came out and scattered into the rain. "I hate that he'll never know I was there. I hate that I chose this. I hate that I was right to choose it." By 6:51 p.m. the next morning, Dr. Sterling sat in the hospital's administrative conference room with his documentation spread before him like armor. Typed accusations. Formal complaints. Investigators' preliminary findings, incomplete, but damaging enough. Patricia from HR sat across from him with her folder. Chairman Whitmore was on speakerphone from his office downtown. Sterling's voice was confident, his narrative prepared. "Gentlemen, the pattern is clear. Unauthorized procedures. Chain of command violations. And according to preliminary background investigation, there's evidence of credential misrepresentation during her original application. We need to move forward with immediate termination." What Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Marcus Chen had been compiling his own file. Not accusations. Evidence. Raw, timestamped, digital evidence. Every frame of Sterling's paralysis. Every frame of Danielle's successful intervention. Every deletion attempt Sterling had made at 6:31 p.m. Chen had called his commanding officer from his reserve unit, a Navy SEAL named Graves who worked in federal law enforcement, at 7:15 a.m. Graves had listened to the situation and said 3 words, "Send me everything." By 8:48 a.m., Graves was walking into Sacred Heart with a federal investigator from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Chen had also been documenting Sterling's systematic campaign against Danielle. The write-ups. The false allegations. The calls to board members designed to undermine her credentials. The intimidation of other nursing staff. By 8:42 a.m., Chen had filed a formal hostile work environment complaint on behalf of the hospital's veteran staff, for current employees and 2 former staff members, all military service members, all of whom had witnessed Sterling's pattern of behavior. The termination hearing that was supposed to destroy Danielle Ross instead became the moment when Dr. James Sterling's entire world collapsed in approximately 12 minutes. The board chairman had arrived in person, his expression grim. The NCIS investigator had entered with Chen's compiled evidence on a tablet. The hospital CEO had stood silent as the security footage played on the conference room monitors, Sterling's frozen hands. The perfectly executed pericardiocentesis. The 380 milliliters drained. The commander's vital signs rising. Every frame an indictment. Dr. Sterling, the CEO had said, her voice like a closing door, "You attempted to delete evidence of your medical negligence and another provider's successful intervention. You fabricated allegations. You created a hostile environment for a decorated combat veteran. Your medical license is under immediate review by the state board. Your employment with Sacred Heart is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." Sterling had reached for his phone. The investigator had confiscated it. Graves had placed a folder on the table in front of him, 10 years of documented complaints Sterling had filed against other staff members, all using the same pattern, all now being reviewed. The board chairman had said one final sentence, "Your resignation from the hospital board is expected by end of business today." And then they had left him sitting there in the conference room with his armor of documentation scattered across the table, every piece of it transformed into evidence of his own misconduct. 2 months later, at a San Diego Community College campus in El Cajon, Dr. James Sterling taught CPR fundamentals to a classroom of 40 people who didn't know his name, who would never know that he had once controlled a trauma bay, that he had once possessed the power to decide who lived and who died. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His career at Sacred Heart was ending in disgrace. The investigator he'd hired had called him at 6:44 p.m. on the day of his firing and said, "Dr. Sterling, I found military service records. That woman isn't a fraud, she's a decorated combat veteran. Navy Senior Chief Petty Officer. 2 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Valor. I'm not burying this." Sterling had hung up without responding. What he didn't know yet, what he would find out in 3 more weeks, was that 3 of his previous victims were now filing complaints with the medical board. 2 of them had been forced to resign under false pretenses. 1 had attempted suicide. The board would recommend revocation of his medical license. The process would take a year. But it would end the same way everything had ended for James Sterling, in silence, in obscurity, in the slow erosion of everything he'd built on the backs of people he'd mistaken for powerless. Back at Sacred Heart, in the trauma bay where it had all happened, a new day was beginning. Danielle Ross had not been fired. The termination hearing had been cancelled. The anonymous Marine veteran in the IT room had seen to it. The federal investigator had seen to it. The unit commander who had arrived with evidence in hand had seen to it. What remained now was the question that hung in the air like a held breath: would she stay hidden? Or would she finally step into the light? If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who sees strength in quiet places. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss these stories. Like this video and comment, would you have revealed yourself to save your reputation, or stayed invisible to protect your peace?